Well, hello! Welcome to 2015, and welcome to the first official episode of Joyful Manna Baptist Fellowship's Manna Minutes. Hi, I'm your host, Daniel Earl, and I do want to thank you for joining me today. So, where are we going to launch out at? That's a pretty good question. I've been giving it some thought, and I thought, why don't we cover this topic of manna? What is manna? All right, let's jump right in and tell you this little story. When the children of Israel first set out from Egypt going to the Promised Land, along the way was a pretty treacherous journey. So God had appointed for them manna to eat. He sent this down in the morning, and he gave them clear instructions that they were supposed to go and collect it daily. Now that manna lasted them all the way up until the very first day that they ate from the fruit of the Promised Land. God sustained them that entire time. God is one of the most curious characters that you're ever going to run into. He does very practical things, and then he uses those practical things to teach us in very curious ways. He's really quirky that way. I actually like it. But Moses discloses for us over in Deuteronomy chapter 8 the reason why God chose this particular practical method. And he gives us a spiritual application in verse 3. He says, "And he humbled you, and let you hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." And does that sound familiar? I hope so, because later Jesus is going to echo those very same words and tell people that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Jesus actually quotes this passage during one of his periods of temptation in the wilderness. That is a pretty incredible thought to me. Later on, in John chapter 6, Jesus is going to actually share with his audience, after he feeds the 5,000, ironically, that he is the bread that came down from heaven. That's a pretty incredible thought. We're going to jump over into 1 Corinthians chapter 10, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we're going to find the New Testament application to these principles. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it starts out and it says that all of the fathers of the Hebrew people, that they passed out of Egypt, that they passed through the same cloud, that they all ate the same spiritual meat, referring to the manna, that they all drank the same spiritual drink, the water that flowed from the rock, and then declares that that rock is Christ. And then in verse 6 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it says, "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but will with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." That's a pretty incredible thought. And it points back to the fact, even over in Nehemiah, there's a reference made to the manna that came down in the wilderness, and that whole passage is littered with the fact that God understands that we are but flesh, and he is merciful and compassionate towards us. So the principles of the manna were this, that they were gathered daily, and that their supply came from God, and that God understands that we are but flesh, and that he provides for us in our circumstances. I can't say every place. In the majority of places that you find this passage, it's just saturated in that environment just repeatedly. And so when we start out with something like a daily devotional and we call it something like Manna Minutes, I want you to understand the concept. God desires a living, daily relationship with you. He understands that we are just flesh, and He provides for us in very real and practical instances so that through the examples of this life we can learn to grow and develop and follow Him. Well, thank you for joining me for this first episode of Manna Minutes. I plan to be back here with you tomorrow, and feel free to join us on Sunday for Manna Live. Okay, it's not really called Manna Live. That's just a fun little segue that I've thought of announcing our church services that take place. Actually, this Sunday, very exciting, we're going to be launching into our new fellowship segment called Stronger Together. So join us for the 11 o'clock hour, and then for lunch, and then for a very informal Bible study on how we can actually grow stronger together as being a part of the Church Universal and the Church Local. I hope you have some questions about that statement I just made, because we're going to address those this Sunday. Lord bless you, and thank you for being here. See you again tomorrow.